The microphone was still live when Frank Sinatra leaned in. The recording engineer could see it happening through the control room glass, but couldn't hear what was being said. Just Frank's mouth moving close to Ella Fitzgerald's ear, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in a gesture that was somehow both casual and significant. Just a few seconds, maybe 10 words at most. Then he stepped back to his own microphone, adjusted his stance, and the engineer gave the signal to start the take. But something had changed. You could hear it immediately from the very first note. What had been professional and polished and perfectly adequate suddenly became something else entirely. Something real. Something that made everyone in that studio, the session musicians who'd played on hundreds of recordings, the engineers who'd heard it all, the producer who'd been checking his watch, stop their routine activities and actually listen. This was supposed to be a simple commercial recording, two legends fulfilling a contractual obligation, another album track to add to already impressive discographies. Instead, it became the performance both of them would later call the most honest, most vulnerable, most genuinely connected thing they'd ever recorded. And it all came down to whatever Frank Sinatra whispered in those 10 seconds before the tape started rolling. The year was 1958, and the music industry was at a crossroads. Rock and roll was challenging the old guard, television was changing how people consumed entertainment, but Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald represented something that transcended trends, pure artistry, technical mastery, voices that defined what excellence sounded like. Frank Sinatra was at the absolute peak of his power. Not just a singer, but a cultural phenomenon. Chairman of the board. The voice. He could fill any venue in the world, sell any record he wanted to make, work with any musician he chose. His career had survived the difficult transition from Bobby Soxer idol to mature artist, emerging stronger on the other side. He moved through the world with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in a way that mattered. Connected to presidents, mobsters, movie stars. His power in the industry was absolute. Ella Fitzgerald was the greatest jazz vocalist alive, and everyone who understood music knew it. Technically perfect with a 3-octave range that seemed to defy human limitations. Emotionally profound in ways that made hardened musicians weep. She'd recorded the songbook series that would cement her legacy as the definitive interpreter of American popular song. Her voice could do things that seemed impossible, the scat singing that sounded like instruments, the perfect pitch that never wavered, the emotional depth that made every lyric feel personal. She was brilliant, and her peers knew it, but they existed in different Americas. Frank was Hollywood, Las Vegas, penthouse suites, and first class everywhere, white, male, connected to power in ways that transcended music. He dated movie stars, befriended politicians, owned pieces of casinos, moved through spaces where the word no was rarely spoken to him. Ella was Harlem, the Apollo Theater, tour buses through the South where she couldn't eat in the same restaurants as her white band members. Black. Female. No matter how brilliant her talent, no matter how many records she sold or awards she won, she faced doors that remained closed. Hotels that wouldn't give her rooms even when her name was on the marquee outside. Clubs that wouldn't book her because they feared white audiences wouldn't accept a black woman as the star attraction. A constant, exhausting reminder that excellence wasn't enough to overcome the color line that divided 1950s America into separate and unequal worlds. When their record labels arranged this collaboration, it made business sense. Two of the biggest names in music recording together would sell records. The marketing practically wrote itself. But artistically, no one expected anything special. This was commerce, not art. The song was Moonlight in Vermont, a gentle ballad about finding peace and beauty in simple moments. Pleasant. Safe. The kind of song that wouldn't offend anyone or challenge anything. Perfect for a commercial release designed to appeal to as many people as possible. The recording session was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon at Capitol Studios in Los Angeles, the legendary circular building on Vine Street where so many classic recordings had been made. Professional. Efficient. The schedule allowed 3 hours, generous by industry standards but not extravagant. Get in, record the track, maybe get a second song, if time permitted, get out. Both Frank and Ella had other commitments that week. Neither wanted to spend more time on this than absolutely necessary. This was work, not art. Business, not passion. Frank arrived first, punctual as always despite his reputation for doing whatever he wanted whenever he felt like it. He reviewed the arrangement with the orchestra. A lush string section, subtle rhythm section, everything designed to showcase the voices without overwhelming them. He made a few suggestions, changed a couple of chord voicings, adjusted the tempo slightly. Everything was professional. Everything was controlled. This was Frank Sinatra's studio, his session, his world. He knew exactly what he wanted and exactly how to get it. When Ella arrived, on time, prepared, professional as always, there was politeness. Handshakes, pleasant greetings. Good to see you, Ella. Thank you for doing this. Frank. The courtesies that people who respect each other's talent exchange. But there was also distance. The kind of distance that exists between people who've heard each other's records, who admire each other's work from afar, but who've never had a real conversation, who exist in overlapping but separate circles. They stood at separate microphones, positioned for optimal sound isolation, but also creating a physical gap between them. Frank on the left side of the studio, Ella on the right, the full orchestra arranged between them like a beautiful musical barrier. Everything was arranged for technical perfection rather than human connection. This was how professional recordings were made. Clean, isolated, controllable. The first rehearsal take was exactly what everyone expected, what everyone had heard 100 times before. Technically flawless. Frank sang his verses with his signature phrasing, the voice smooth and controlled, every note exactly where it should be. Ella responded with her verses, her pitch perfect, as always, her tone warm and inviting. The orchestra provided elegant support, the arrangement working exactly as written. It was professional, polished, radio ready, completely, utterly forgettable. The engineer in the booth made notes about levels and balance. The producer nodded approval. This would work fine. They could probably get a usable take within the next few attempts. Everyone could go home on time. They ran through it again. Same result. Perfect execution, zero emotional connection. Frank and Ella were performing in the same room, but might as well have been recording separately and having their tracks mixed together later. There was no chemistry, no conversation, no sense that two human beings were actually communicating through music. The producer called for a short break. Frank stepped away from the microphone, lit a cigarette. Everyone smoked in studios back then, checked his watch. Still plenty of time. They'd get this done. Ella stood at her mic, reviewing the sheet music, even though she'd already memorized every note, every word, every breath mark. The professional distance remained intact. Two planets orbiting in the same solar system, but never actually touching. But Frank was watching Ella in a way he hadn't been before, not just as a fellow performer, not just as a voice on the other side of the studio, but as a person. And he was seeing things that the professional exterior didn't quite hide. The way she stood slightly apart from everyone else during the break, not joining the casual conversation among the orchestra members. The way the string players chatted among themselves about weekend plans and the recording date they'd just finished, but no one included her in the banter. The way the contractor had greeted Frank with a handshake and a joke, but had given Ella only a polite nod. The way she seemed isolated even in a room full of people, surrounded but alone. Frank Sinatra knew something about isolation. Not the same kind Ella experienced. His privilege, his whiteness, his maleness protected him from most of what she faced daily. But he understood what it felt like to be seen as a symbol rather than a person. To have people respond to the idea of you, Frank Sinatra, the legend, the voice, the star, rather than who you actually were when the spotlight went dark. To be constantly performing even when you weren't technically on stage. To wonder if anyone actually saw you, or just the carefully constructed image you'd spent years building. And watching Ella stand there alone in a crowded studio, professionally perfect but humanly isolated, something shifted in him. This wasn't just another session. This was a person who deserved better than the professional distance everyone was maintaining. He walked over to where Ella stood. The movement surprised her. They'd been maintaining the professional distance, the unspoken boundary between them. His approach broke that pattern. "Can I tell you something?" he asked quietly. Ella nodded, uncertain. Frank glanced at the control booth, at the engineer making adjustments, at the orchestra members on break. Then he leaned in close, his mouth near her ear so no one else could hear, and he said something. The cameras positioned around the studio for promotional footage caught the moment. You can see Frank's mouth moving. You can see Ella's face change as she listens, but the audio wasn't rolling yet. Whatever he said exists only in the memory of two people who were there. Ella's expression shifted. Her shoulders lowered slightly. Her eyes, which had been carefully neutral, showed something else. Recognition, understanding, maybe relief. She nodded, said something back that was equally inaudible to everyone else, and then Frank stepped back to his own microphone. The engineer's voice came through the speakers. Ready for another take?
Yeah.
Frank said. Let's do this one right. The orchestra began the introduction. Same arrangement, same key, same tempo, everything technically identical to the previous takes. But when Frank and Ella began singing, everyone in that studio immediately understood that something fundamental had changed. Frank's voice carried a different quality now, still smooth, still controlled, but with an undercurrent of genuine emotion. He wasn't just singing words about moonlight and Vermont. He was singing to someone about something real, and Ella responded not as a separate performer doing her assigned verses, but as someone in conversation. Her phrases answered his. Her timing shifted to create a genuine musical dialogue. The distance between the two microphones suddenly felt irrelevant because the distance between the two performers had dissolved. The lyrics talked about finding peace and beauty, but the way Frank and Ella sang them transformed generic sentiment into something personal. You could hear mutual respect. You could hear two artists who genuinely saw each other as equals despite everything the world tried to tell them about hierarchy and difference. When they reached the bridge, the moment where both voices came together in harmony, something magical happened. Their voices blended not just technically, but emotionally. Frank's baritone and Ella's soprano creating a sound that felt intimate despite being broadcast through expensive microphones and captured on professional recording equipment. The producer in the booth leaned forward. The engineer stopped checking his meters and just listened. The orchestra members, who'd been going through the motions on the earlier takes, played with renewed attention. Everyone recognized they were witnessing something special. As the song concluded, the final notes fading into silence, no one moved for several seconds. The moment felt too fragile to interrupt. Then the producer's voice came through the speakers. That's the one. That's definitely the one. Frank and Ella looked at each other across their separate microphones. Smiled. Not the polite professional smiles from earlier, but genuine warmth. Something had shifted between them in those few minutes, something that went beyond the commercial transaction this session was supposed to be. After the session wrapped, after the orchestra packed up their instruments and the engineers began their technical work of mixing and mastering, after the producer had shaken both their hands and told them they'd just recorded something special, Frank and Ella stood in the parking lot outside Capitol Studios talking for nearly an hour. The Los Angeles sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and two of the most famous people in America stood next to Frank's car talking like old friends even though they'd barely known each other that morning. Not about the recording, not about business or contracts or the next project. Just talking. About music they loved, about performers they admired, about the loneliness of touring and the exhaustion of always being on. About what it felt like to be reduced to a voice, a product, a commodity when you were trying to be a human being making art. Two people who'd spent their lives being symbols and legends, taking a rare moment to just be Frank and Ella. Two musicians who understood each other in ways most people couldn't. Years later, interviewers would ask both of them about that recording session, about what made that particular performance so special when both of them had recorded hundreds of songs with dozens of other artists. The technical questions came easy. They could talk about phrasing and dynamics and the arrangement. But when asked about the emotional quality, about what made that recording feel different, both of them became more guarded. There was a moment, Ella would say, choosing her words carefully, never quite revealing the full truth, where I felt seen, really seen, not as a voice or a performer or a product, but as a person, as an artist, as someone with something to say, and it changed how I approached the song. It changed everything, really. Frank would be similarly vague but equally sincere when pressed about it. Sometimes you connect with someone on a level that goes beyond the music. He'd say, deflecting with charm but meaning every word. That session with Ella was one of those times. Something just clicked. We stopped performing for the microphones and started performing for each other, and that made all the difference. But neither would reveal what Frank had whispered. That remained private, a moment between two people that belonged only to them. The recording was released as a single and later included on a compilation album. Critics noted the unusual emotional depth for what should have been a straightforward commercial duet. Listeners responded to something they couldn't quite articulate but could definitely feel. The record sold well, but more importantly, it endured. Decades later, musicians still study that recording, trying to understand what made it so special. What Frank Sinatra whispered to Ella Fitzgerald that day in 1958 has been the subject of speculation ever since. Some people guess he said something about her talent. Some think he shared a joke to help her relax. Some believe he made a political statement about equality and respect. But people who knew both of them well have a different theory. They think Frank simply acknowledged what everyone in that room was pretending not to see. The isolation, the otherness, the constant professional performance required of Ella in spaces where she was rarely fully welcome. And he let her know that he saw it. That in this moment, in this room, she didn't have to perform anything except the music, that she could just be present as an artist and a human being. Whatever he said, the effect was clear. The wall between them disappeared. The professional distance evaporated. What replaced it was genuine connection. Two artists who respected each other's talent suddenly also respecting each other's humanity. The impact went beyond that one recording session. Frank and Ella became genuine friends. Not the Hollywood kind of friendship that exists only for publicity photos, but real friendship. They'd call each other between tours. Share stories about difficult audiences and impossible demands. Support each other through personal and professional challenges. Frank used his considerable power in the industry to help Ella access opportunities that had been systematically denied to her despite her extraordinary talent. He made phone calls that opened doors previously locked tight, applied pressure to venues and promoters who thought they could ignore the greatest vocalist alive because of the color of her skin. Not as charity or condescension. Frank respected Ella too much for that, but as one artist helping another artist who deserved better than she was getting. The most famous example was the Mocambo incident. The Mocambo Club in Los Angeles was one of the most prestigious venues in the country, a place where being seen mattered as much as being heard. The kind of room that could transform a respected artist into a mainstream star, but when Ella's manager tried to book her there in the mid-1950s, the owner refused. Not because of talent, everyone knew Ella could fill any room, but because they thought her appearance, her race, wouldn't attract their wealthy, white clientele, because they were afraid that booking a black woman as the star attraction would somehow diminish their reputation. Frank heard about this and made a phone call, made it very clear in language that left no room for misinterpretation, that if the Mocambo wanted him to perform there again, and his appearances were guaranteed sellouts that brought Hollywood elite through their doors, they needed to book Ella. And not just book her, but treat her with the respect she deserved, front the room properly, promote her like the star she was, make it clear that she was the attraction, not some novelty act. The Mocambo owner capitulated. How could he not? Frank Sinatra's influence meant money, prestige, access to the industry's elite, and Frank made good on his end too. He showed up to Ella's opening night, sat front row center where everyone could see him, brought celebrity friends, made sure the photographers knew he was there specifically to support her. His presence gave her legitimacy in a space that had tried to deny her entrance. His endorsement forced the white audience to take her seriously as the artist she'd always been. Ella never forgot what Frank had done, how his friendship had mattered. Years later, long after Frank's death in 1998, she would talk about how being seen and valued as an equal had given her confidence to demand respect rather than just hoping for it. How that recording session had taught her that she didn't always have to carry the burden of representation alone, that sometimes allies appeared in unexpected places, but it all traced back to that recording session, to those few whispered words that transformed a commercial obligation into genuine artistic connection, to the moment when two people stopped being Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald, the symbols, the legends, the carefully constructed public personas, and became Frank and Ella, two human beings making music together, two artists who saw each other not as symbols of their respective worlds, but as kindred spirits navigating the impossible demands of fame and artistry. The recording of Moonlight in Vermont still exists, available on streaming services and compilation albums. Listen to it alongside recordings of other Sinatra, Fitzgerald collaborations, if there had been others, and you can hear the difference. The later attempts to recreate that magic never quite worked, not because the talent wasn't there, but because that particular moment of genuine connection can't be manufactured or repeated on demand. Music historians have analyzed the recording, breaking down the technical elements, The phrasing, the dynamics, the way the voices blend and separate. But technical analysis misses the point. What makes that recording special isn't technique, it's humanity, it's two people actually seeing each other and letting that recognition inform their art. In the decades since, the recording has been covered by other artists trying to capture what made it special. Jazz singers attempt Ella's phrasing, pop singers imitate Frank's tone, but no one has ever quite replicated the emotional quality. Because you can't fake genuine connection. You can't manufacture the moment when two people stop performing and start being real with each other. The video footage from that session, the promotional material shot for publicity purposes, shows the moment of the whisper. Grainy black and white film capturing Frank leaning in, Ella listening, her expression changing. That footage has been viewed millions of times by people trying to read lips, trying to decode what was said. But maybe the mystery is the point. Maybe what matters isn't the specific words, but the fact that the words were said at all. That in a professional recording session designed for commercial purposes, two human beings took a moment to actually see each other, and that moment of recognition transformed everything that followed. Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald never recorded another duet quite like Moonlight in Vermont. They performed together occasionally over the years, always professional, always talented. But that particular alchemy, that specific moment of connection, remained unique to that one afternoon in 1958. Both of them carried that recording with them for the rest of their careers. In interviews, when asked about their proudest musical moments, both frequently mentioned it, not because it was technically superior to other work. Both recorded performances that were more impressive from a pure skill standpoint, but because it represented something they'd rarely found in their professional lives, a moment when the performance fell away and what remained was just genuine human connection expressed through music. That's the real legacy. Not just a beautiful recording, though it is that, but proof that even in the most commercial, most professional contexts, there's room for real human connection. That seeing someone, truly seeing them, can transform not just a recording session, but the relationship between two people. The microphone was still live when Frank Sinatra leaned in. Whatever he whispered changed everything. Not because the words themselves had magic power, but because they created a moment of genuine recognition. And in that moment, two of the greatest artists of their generation stopped being legends and became human beings making music together. The recording remains. The whisper remains a mystery, but the impact is undeniable. Sometimes the most important thing isn't what you sing, but how you make the person singing with you feel seen, valued, and understood. Frank and Ella figured that out one Tuesday afternoon in 1958, and you can hear it in every note they sang together that day.